If you think about the market as just a system of supply and demand, it's trying to make sense of what people want, what people create, and how we just match those. And AI is just going to be another layer of abstraction, the same way that the internet is just this mesh layer of abstraction for information. Information being something that, like goods, can be unevenly distributed. Suddenly, everyone has access to all the same information. AI is another layer on top of that. Welcome back to the Amagi Village podcast. I'm your host, Lily, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. After 2 seasons of interviews with wonderful guests, those who are in our community, who are building Amagi Village from the inside, as well as people who inspire us, I'm here putting myself in the hot seat a little bit to, interview myself. Because I'd love to share with you, I think, a lot of the lessons that I've been reflecting from everything that we've learned these past 2 seasons. So bear with me. I might get rambly at parts, but I hope that I can give a satisfactory payoff, because what I'd love to share with you today is a little bit of my understanding of the vision of Amagi. What exactly is the blueprint that we're trying to hone in on? And really what the point is, like, we're trying to build a product. We're trying to build a solution. We are a company who wants to serve customers at the end of the day. But who is that customer? Why are we even trying to solve this problem? I think that's some of what I want to circle today a little bit more specifically, because I think it probably comes through in the podcast episodes loosely what we're about. But because I have guests on those conversations, I want to let them be the stars and step back a little bit and just be a good student, be a good intellectual playmate. But I definitely have some opinions, so I'm excited here to take the chance to share some of those with you. And maybe they resonate, maybe they don't. What's been beautiful about Amagi Village is that it really is meant to be a village. There's no one singular viewpoint that's going to define our future. And I think having these conversations, even if we don't always agree, it's just good to have the conversation, because we are engaged and it gives us a little bit more direction in the future. But I think that's also been the challenge, is because as wonderful people as Kier and Ofer are, it's a collaboration. And so we're genuinely trying not to have a dictator come in and say exactly what Amagi is. But that itself comes with challenges, as I think sometimes things can be a bit nebulous. So to get things started off concretely, I'd like to go down a little vein, because I think this is a very interesting moment in time, civilizationally, technologically, and as well as the meta. After 2 seasons of 10 episodes each, there's some lessons to chew on. And I want to get started by having a conversation about AI. I think if you're anywhere close to tech, this is top of your mind. And it's something that definitely gets a lot of differing opinions, depending, I guess, on where you sit on the political spectrum and where you get your news. And being a sort of chronically online Twitter person, following the technology leaders and builders that I do, you might not be surprised, I have a pretty optimistic and favorable view of AI. As a mother, as someone who has chosen to bring children into this world, as an entrepreneur myself, I'm just an optimist. I don't think that I'm a particularly radical optimist, but I think that if you're going to build something, you need a certain level of optimism and delusion to carry yourself through. And I'm determined to be optimistic about AI. I really buy into the abundance narrative, but I can understand that it's a radical departure from the world that we are currently living in. The modern moment, like the cultural and intellectual and institutional waters of modernity, I think can be so invisible to us because we're just so used to it. But I think we're on the verge of a sea change, of a paradigm shift, like unlike anything we've seen since the Industrial Revolution. And none of us were there. We have recorded history, but none of us actually experienced the angst or the opportunity that folks felt when things were radically changing. And we live in an age where technology is just more rapidly accelerating. This is the kind of thing that has an exponential growth curve, which is very exciting, but also frankly scary. And so when it comes to AI, I think the thing that people talk about the most is, oh, AI is going to take our jobs. And that, frankly, for me, is just a big eye roll. I don't think AI is going to take our jobs, because if you look at the structure of history, if you look at the structure of society and what people do, it's not that AI is going to take our jobs, but I think AI is going to completely rewrite organizations and institutions. And we've lived through that before. Like I said, with the Industrial Revolution, we used to have home economies, village scale economies, fiefdoms, and all of the political structures that came on top of that. And we reorganized things in terms of factories, markets, urban centers really became the economic center of gravity in a very new way. And we take all those things with the invention of mercantilism and colonialism and capitalism, and we fast forward it into this moment. But when you look at the jobs to be done, the fundamental jobs are still going to be there, because we're still in our meat bodies. We are still biological beings who have evolutionary needs. And so the jobs are still there. So I think when you take a step back and just look at the historical view and how radically life has changed and how strange modern life is, it is really, really weird. I think this might actually be a time for us to normalize, because I don't think the AI is going to take our jobs, but AI is going to fundamentally rewrite who is doing those jobs and how the value is assigned, because we still need to eat. And before we went and shopped in supermarkets, we grew our own food, or we bought it from others who lived in the village with us. We traded and bartered. Before we sent our children to public schools, before such a thing existed, schooling and education was something that was in the hands of the families, or maybe you might have local religious organizations who took care of that. We used to build our own houses with local materials and local technology. Then came, mass housing construction. Then you had real estate agents and developers and all these different layers and systems that were built atop new organizational layers. Does that make sense? And so if you are scared of AI taking your jobs, I will be perfectly honest, I judge you a little bit, because I think, what does that say about the value that you provide? Like, do you provide human value? Do you do something that people actually care about? Or are you just a cog in an institutional machine? Because I think what's actually much scarier and more exciting is AI is going to fundamentally rewrite our institutions. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's scary because change is scary and we really can't predict how it's going to shake out. I think there is a genuinely good chance that this whole middle class thing that we've invented, which is kind of a 20th century aberration, really. It's not something that's historically normal. It might go away. What if that gets wiped out? What if this K-shaped economy is a real thing? What if there is a permanent underclass? How do I not be in the permanent underclass? I don't claim to be enough of an economic expert to predict. I don't think anyone really can predict. And that's scary, but it's also exciting, because a lot of modern life is actually not really good for us. And I think that's one of the things that I've been very excited to sort of discuss within the Amagi project. It's what does a good life actually mean? Because for a long time, that's been a bit prescriptive. You need to live in a good place to have good material conditions, to be able to earn good money so that you can take care of your family. And there's always been a hope that you can leave your children better off than you were in your life, right? Leave a little bit of a legacy. And we've really built atop this notion of progress. And I think, again, that's the very scary thing. We've been building atop a very specific paradigm where our great-grandparents, our grandparents, and to some extent our parents could predict the world that they would grow up in. But my children are 2 and 4 years old. I have no idea what world they're going to grow up in. But rather than being scared of that, I choose to be an optimist because I think the world that they can grow up in might actually look a lot more recognizable to our ancestors than some Jetson sci-fi vision of the future. And I certainly don't think it's going to be dystopian. The modern world has changed so fast that we can't always adapt our culture quickly enough. And cultural adaptation, like being progressive, isn't actually always a good thing, which to me is one of the interesting concepts that I got from my conversation with Michelle Bowens is this whole notion of transmodernism, that in this moment in time, maybe the best thing isn't just to try to be progressive and future forward. Maybe actually we want to bring in lessons from the past. And that's not that's not to return just purely to traditional times, because I don't think that's the point either, because there's a lot we want to preserve about modernity. That's good. The world of technology and smart capital allocation and states, all these different layers of organization have allowed us to create a lot of material abundance. But at this moment in time, does material abundance actually serve us? Because it's good. It's really good to not have to deal with famine and wars and all of that bad stuff. But a lot of the issues that we're experiencing now in modernity actually just come with, a lot of options, but are we necessarily taking the right options? And is what's normal in society actually good for us? So how do we have the best of material abundance with the best of human outcomes? And I think that's what's interesting in this moment. And that to me is what's so compelling about AI, because all these technologies, all these innovations of organizational layers of things like the market economy, things like the internet, things like a globalized network, with AI, with decision-making, with compute, with just organization being so much more efficient. Like, what can we figure out, so that we can take out some of the admin and some of the pain points for the humans? Because there's a lot of really stupid, inefficient stuff that we still do. The last 200 years of the Industrial Revolution and markets and globalization have brought a lot of material benefits, but it's also been a shift of value assignment from, I think, at the very local level to a very institutional level. And I think that's the thing that's actually threatening is in the 21st century, can we retain our institutions? Because I think a lot of problems that people experience at the state level are actually due to institutional capture, right? And systems getting hijacked. And that's something that we've experienced at plenty of points in history before. I think feudalism actually probably had its strong points, but we mostly historically talk about why that didn't work, because there's a wonderful propaganda machine for why we have nation states instead. And with AI, we have an opportunity to just reorganize things at a different trophic level. And I think that's interesting because instead of having a centrally planned economy, I think a lot of these things can be decentralized and maybe more localized. And that's a very good thing. So yeah, if you're worried about AI taking your job, my question to you is what value do you provide? Because the jobs to be done are still going to be there, but how are you connecting the thing that you make with the people? That's the interesting question, and I think that's the problem that's worth solving. A lot of people say that middle management is going to be gutted, but I think as a bit of a middle management person myself, I actually see AI as a force multiplier. The people whose jobs are coding, which is something that the AI is brilliant at, I've never seen my husband, the developer, work harder in his life. He'll spin off 5 agents at a time and work on his main client projects, his side projects, just building a Telegram API applet for family organization. People who want to create and do things are just in a really unique position to do those, right? And I think a lot of folks are having a lot of fun. I know anytime I talk to Gear now, he's always just on about whichever model is like new and exciting and what videos and content that he's creating with that. So sorry, it's a bit of a ramble doing a solo episode. But yeah, I don't think middle management is going to get gutted because people who like to create, people who actually generate value are still going to do those. A lot of middle management, like the paper pushers, the people who just do pure admin work, the people whose jobs solely exist because the institution needs to have these presentation and safety layers, like, yeah, I think a lot of that's going to get reassigned to AI. But a lot of what management does is actually like people jobs. It's like it's managing up. It's making sure information is communicated well. It's keeping people motivated. And if you do those jobs well, I think like you may just end up in a post-AI world with just a more accurate job description rather than no job. So again, that's the lens through which I look at AI and disruption. Jobs are still going to be there. People should still be doing things. But I don't think that we're going to have the same corporate institutional structures. I think things are going to flatten in really weird ways. I don't entirely know. Someone that would be a dream guest of mine on the podcast is Tim Urban of the Wait But Why podcast, Wait But Why blog. And in his, in what ultimately became his book, The Story of Us, was he had a very interesting way of just looking at the sort of trophic levels of organization, from the cell to the organism to the family to the village. And, you know, because AI is an information and organizational layer, you know, built on top of the internet, which made information equally available to people, built atop of capitalism and the market, which made material goods much more equally accessible to people than before, right? So all these different layers of abundance, AI is just doing the next thing. But I think what's actually interesting is, as a technology, I think it allows us to choose how we apply governance systems on a different level. And that's where, you know, something like Amagi, building for the future village in a very like for an AI future, is where we tie into efforts like the network state project. Is rather than things having to be organized sequentially and getting like more and more complex, actually I think there's a lot of opportunity to devolve authority to the lower layers, because suddenly you can coordinate a lot of people with a lot less, just with a lot less overhead. And this whole network state thing, it's very interesting to me. I'm a big believer in it, but I do think that despite AI coming for our present institutions, sounds so malevolent. Yeah, I think that's going to happen. But we need the nation state. You know, I think a lot of these experiments, the ones that have the longest legs, are those special economic zone ones, right? That are going to respect the role of nation state. So, you know, I noticed at one point that we had a shortage of elders for our interviews on the podcast. So it was wonderful to speak to Manoj from Oroville in India. And I think there's a lesson there. They're facing an existential crisis, both because of the aging population of the residents, but also because when the community was founded many years ago, the Indian state hadn't sent its tentacles out to where they lived. They had a lot of freedom to operate. But now, as land rights have formalized, as there's much more competition for land with their neighbors, it creates these new kinds of disputes that they have to manage. And so, yeah, when it comes to these special economic zones and communities, respecting the current nation state as it is, I think, is really important. I think we got to build parallel structures, not I think it's hard to fight against the headwinds because we need some stability in the system, right? Where I find network state experiments really compelling. Oh, it was so fun to be able to speak to Sandre, whose work at Safety Wing I've just been a fan of for a long time, because to me, their whole conception of like an internet country as being services, right? Like look at the nation state as a SaaS stack and think about how you can do that in the cloud. And as a Safety Wing being an insurance company first, focusing on people's like health, and because he's, he's Norwegian. He comes from a country that has a strong central planning and the resources to have a strong social safety net. He's like, okay, can we create a product that makes that accessible by voluntary opt-in? Those are the aspects of the network state that I really think are going to take off. That's because that's the global coordination layer where people have a parallel solution to the state. That doesn't require them to commit by voting with their feet, but just, again, by being anywhere, you have access to remote work, the internet economy, information, education, social communities, and this social safety net, so that if you lose your job, you have a health issue, you're protected. It's you have all of these, and because you can count on all these coming from the internet, then the choices that you make that are land-based, that are like proximity-based, that are like physical, you're so much more free to choose those. And so those things really go hand in hand to me. So I think if you'd spoken to me like 2 years ago or whatever it was, before I've been doing this podcast and really think and being invited to think deeply and learn from folks in this space, I think I would have had a hard time following the whole like AI equals abundance. But now I can see it's just a different kind of efficiency is about to be created, but it really is going to greatly benefit people who are highly agentic, who want to take advantage of those opportunities, people who are good at making intentional choices for themselves. And the people who are going to be stuck in this so-called permanent underclass, and I think the ones that we need to worry about, and I think arguably take some societal responsibility for, are the folks who I think are just normal, the normies who just want to do what everyone else is doing and not have to think too hard about it. And that is, I think, what we can maybe shift the direction of Amagi in a little bit, because I think a lot of the folks that we speak to, that we are learning from, are rebels, are people who are pushing the frontier, who are exploring the bleeding edge of things. And that's wonderful. But at the end of the day, can we take all those lessons and rebellions and synthesize them into something that's going to be beneficial for the normal people? Because you would have thought that in the year of our Lord, 2026, we would, with all this material abundance and freedom and options, that people would have solved their own problems. But it turns out that that's not what human nature is like, and maybe we need some better opinions from the culture, from society, from our architecture, all sorts of things to actually suggest us into a path of making better choices. Because it turns out more freedom, more options, the kind of like liberalizing aim, the sort of progressive arc, doesn't actually lead to the outcomes that we think it's gonna. And yeah, I guess I have a sense of humor about that because we're human. And yeah, this is just a really great moment in time to sort of have a little bit of humility, but just not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just get intentional with it. And in almost every episode of the podcast that I've hosted, there's usually been a moment in the conversation where I kind of ask, like, okay, so what's your founder story, or what's your red pill moment? When did you step out of the matrix? What shocked you or inspired you into building the solution that you're building? How did that happen? Because again, I think the audience of this podcast and the people who are interested in Amagi have much more agency in their world, and are much more likely to take risks. But that's not normal. That's not like the bell curve chunk of humanity. Most people don't think that way. And even very smart people, I think the world of the 20th century has actually groomed smart people to participate in the system, because that's when you have the biggest wins, because we're building in a stable system where you wanted to learn how to play the rules of the game. But suddenly, when things are changing so fast, it's a different game. And so the game is now weighted towards those who are willing to be a little bit weird and agentic. And I think the pandemic is something that many people sort of quoted as their moment. That was what Elodie said really made her realize, look into her children's education. She founded Boundless Life and jumped on board with the world schooling lifestyle, because even though she was a child of teachers and had good things to say about school, she realized once her children were in her home being educated during lockdown that like she wanted to make different choices than I think the French government would be making for her. And so she took that into her own hands. Speaking to Rosanna Lopez, she really spoke about how remote work during that time became much more democratized. Suddenly, it wasn't just digital nomads, but the pandemic created all these newbie nomads who wanted to explore the world and see what options were at their fingertips. And the episode with Patrick Friedman, I think, really he takes it onto the institutional layer. If you think about, during the global lockdown, it really exposed the cracks in the matrix, because all these people, all these authorities that so many of us just trusted, suddenly it was a really divisive world where there was a lot of stakes, and something that was pushed as the institutional narrative as correct and normal 1 week, suddenly weeks later, things would be completely flipped. And how do you maintain trust in your institutions when things are when the cracks are just like so apparent in front of you? And I think that's something that's probably resonated with a lot of our audience. It certainly has for me. And again, I don't think this is a coincidence, because the world sort of got so much more connected and so efficient, and things like a just-in-time production. We created so many efficiencies in like the globalized economy that it actually was not very resilient. And so we realized that, there was like a optimum level of connectedness that we could actually aim for. Whereas perhaps when we were trying to push at the bounds of progress, we were just looking at maximizing everything. And so, I don't think these things are a coincidence. I think we've been for a long time looking at how do we max this. Even such good things as liberalism and freedom, we may have actually found the max point that actually creates more problems. And now is a time to reflect and just choose the optimum that we want to aim for. I gave a talk at Kolu Fukuoka, which is this big annual nomad gathering in this wonderful city in Japan, where I spoke about why I think digital nomads are civilizational signals. And the kind of thesis of that is that when you give some of the most technologically enabled, globally mobile, some of the most privileged people in the world, right? When you pay attention to the choices that they make, we're realizing that a lot of they're trendsetters. I think digital nomads are just a little earlier to the trends because of just all those layers of privilege of just being you're from the Western world or having a strong European passport, being able to travel, all of these things. They have more choice. And this group of people chose to exercise their choices and just create a different lifestyle. But we've actually seen that movement has matured. And it's not just about freedom anymore. It's a lot about choices, making intentional choices. I did a lot of work in digital nomad visa policy, and I looked at that from the lens of a marketer. Like, countries should be creating funnels to attract digital nomads, You don't just want people to be exploiting tourist visas and doing things in the gray market. If you want to normalize it, you have to give them a good stepping stone, because it's also a big leap to take someone from like tourist to like, immigrant, like permanent resident. Some people want to settle down, but some people don't. And I think when you pay attention to what digital nomads have been doing, and in particular, that nomad to settler arc, because a lot of the folks that have been interested in Amagi have had that freedom. they've enjoyed it. They've tasted the world. They've just like evolved their assumptions. They've taken the chance to be in different environments, to grow, to learn. But at some point, I think people really want home, and they want to choose where they settle. And the world is also in a weird place where like you want the prodigal son to return, but for a lot of people, change has been happening so quickly that you can't return home. Like the world that you grew up in just no longer exists, whether that's because of changing economic conditions, because of demographic shifts, immigration. It's all just very much more layered these days. And so, yeah, I've looked at digital nomads as a civilizational signal. And when people think about attracting nomads, to think about it very intentionally, because you don't just want to get nomads for the sake of nomads themselves. You want to understand the point of integrating these people into your society. What good are they bringing? And is it compatible with what your local citizenry needs? And I think I used to be like a big pro-global mobility. I just thought like freedom was the ultimate expression. Whereas I think I've gotten a little older and just a little more naturally conservative. And I've sort of realized actually it's a wonderful thing when you have your own place. It makes me really sad for the people who can't go home. I grew up here in Chiang Mai, and I had the chance to go live in America, where my dad is from. I had the chance to go work and study internationally, and I ultimately chose to come home and invest in this place, in this community. And it's been very enriching. And I think that is actually a much more like natural and human thing. One of the reasons I'm such a fan of remote work is, again, it just gives people choice. Rather than feeling forced to move to the city, they have a choice. And that choice is sometimes to come home. And I think that's the thing that's like kind of under-indexed. But the whole opportunity for Amagi is also that this is a good time for people to start thinking about how to create a new home. And that's where the conversation with, again, Patrick Friedman talking about startup cities, and with Gonzalo Hall, who's now been spending time at Prospera, it's like, okay, we have these new opportunities to settle a very global, technologically connected people. We have this chance to create a new society. What can Amagi learn from that? And what's been interesting to observe is that the tech side, the innovation side, the legal structure side, that's actually kind of the easy part. Arguably on like the nomad visa thing, even the very difficult work of like convincing a government to come up with a visa, like I've been there, done that. It's not easy. Government works very slowly. But even that turns out to be the easy part, because the hard part is actually creating a real society. And that's something I really appreciated talking to Janine about Edge City. And I'm so happy to see her like recent reports from the current pop-up in Edge City Esmeralda, where she's got her baby right now, because I think that was one of the weak points that I observed, of all the wonderful things that Edge City Lana did when they were in Chiang Mai. As a mother myself, I didn't get to participate so much in the child intergenerational like agenda. I thought was like planned but not executed. And it's wonderful to see this cohort growing and making families welcome. And that's something that I've also observed, with a lot of folks in our community are fans of Balaji and go to the Network State Conference, who've gone to Garden City in Malaysia. And my little like bugbear is, when is there going to be a program for families? Because you can create all these new aspirational societies, but until you are actually creating a container that normal people can live in, and that means families, that means a place where people can age as well eventually, where you're integrated, where you're not just creating a little like offshoot colony where any of the people who are there should be benefiting. It's just a big mix, And I think for me, children become the natural organizing principle, because children have always been the natural organizing principle. They're the point of civilization. A lot of times when we use the sustainability, people assume that means like the green eco side. And this was, of course, something that Dora and I explored in her episode. She talks about how regenerative is the new sustainable, right? When you use the word sustainable, like in what context do you mean? It's great if everything is green and growing and you're doing things responsibly for the local ecology. But at the end of the day, does that really mean anything if you are not financially sustainable, if this thing is not intergenerational? And so I think that's been one of the things that I've really wanted to bring into the Amagi project. And that's where I think it's unique, because Gear wanted to do this whole project because he wanted a village where he could raise his kids and also do entrepreneurship without going crazy. And I think the village is a right-sized structure for that. For Ofer, he really wanted to take the wonderful community aspects of like the lifestyle that he sort of discovered in Kopangan and just do that with nice people. For myself, I was interested in this concept of the village because I felt so isolated after I had my first baby that I'm still just like, so many entrepreneurs just do things because they have a chip on their shoulder, and that's certainly mine. I'm just like, how do I never experience that level of isolation again? Because again, it's this historical anomaly. We used to raise children together. So yeah, to connect to like this rant, yeah, we have a unique opportunity to organize society, to use technology to manage things with a lot less overhead at different trophic levels. And I think that's interesting because it means that I think there are certain parts of human wiring that actually like are happy with authoritarianism, and other sides where we're actually prefer socialism. But because we've always assigned those levels of power at the state, it's created a lot of problems because the state has also been the structure that gets the monopoly on violence, right? So if we're going to keep the states around, is it actually better for us to apply harsher controls, more equality at very different trophic levels? And now we have the decentralized technology to do so. That's something that came up in my episode with Daniel Espino, right? Talking about DAOs and swarms and organizational behavior. And that's not, directly AI. I think these things are all like adjacent. They're all feeding into each other. Is we just have the technology to try things with a different layer for human coordination. And that's technological as well as, I think, cultural, which I think just comes back to this whole nomad thing and this very international viewpoint. When you have people who've tried on a lot of different cultures and you can see like, oh, is my culture the best for this? Or is this place a better host culture? For the family thing, for example, like I love Thailand. I think it's a wonderful place to for us to be building this village because fortunately we have a lot of traditionalism intact. People still love children. And that's something that I think some of the more developed parts of the Western world have kind of lost, is that sort of sense of collective responsibility for the next generation. And that doesn't need to be programmed back in, And that's going back. We've worked so hard on maximizing certain things like optionality and freedom and self-expression, authenticity, that it leads some people to just more naturally make the selfish choice. And I don't think that says that society is bad or that those people are bad. That just is a thing that maybe we ought to notice is being kind of coded in. And do we want to keep that or not? It's a little bit easier to build this new village level organization if you care about kids and fostering the next generation, when the sort of cultural substrate is there. Yeah, I think the word for this that I got from Michelle Bowens is transmodernism. I think definitely becoming a mom has been a bit of a transition for me, going from the girl boss life to the trad life. And there's been parts of that where I definitely felt like I was LARPing at it because I had no idea what I was doing. And then so I tried to get into sourdough, and I'm just not good at sourdough. But what I am really good at is making babies and hosting play dates. All of my previous work in community, organizing meetups, bringing people together and hosting, it's just a natural skill that I can now apply in a new context for the families that we want to have in our community, right? Not to get too tinfoil hatty, but I think a lot of the work of modernity and progress has been to push women out of the home sphere. And I think this is, again, it's a very interesting moment where we can return with choice, with intention, and just think about like what should be the default options. Because I think we should be making decisions that are healthy for individuals and the collective as a default. Like the defaults should be easy. You should not have to be a rebel. You should not have to work so hard, pay extra money to have access to these things. Can we design a society around that? And yeah, in our own family composition, like I use tech, my husband's developer, I can work from home part-time when I want to, really focus on being with my kids. And we can try to have like a screen-free childhood, spend lots of time outdoors in our community, but also have access to like AI and things like Khan Academy for educating our children, and not be isolated in that way. We can have a garden and have land, but also have the opportunity to travel and see friends internationally. So yeah, this is transmodernism, as Michelle Bowens describes it, as just my interpretation of that is just, yeah, you get to pick and choose from the best of many different points in time and apply it to your own situation. And it's also cosmolocalism, which is just the idea that you can be part of a global interconnected network that brings all these benefits of efficiencies and organization layers, but you yourself are rooted locally. And again, that ties into the network state communities that we're adjacent to. And I think it's wonderful to have this concept. It's so useful for people to start building projects around that layer of organization. But I think my observation is that actually the network side of it is much easier to build and to grow. But it's how does that connect to the local side, of the cosmolocal spectrum? We want to make sure both sides are strong. And I think we already live in this like very globalized society as far as like market and culture. Like we are so networked already. I think that's the part of the equation that like people are like over indexing, whereas it's the local side that we ought to be spending more time with. And again, in my work with, nomad visas as a like relocation funnel, how to get people to place, considerations of intentional communities and where people plant themselves. One guest that we're still really hoping to get at some point is Kevin Owaki, because I think it's so interesting how he's sort of gone from like this AI for abundance, for better capital allocation in public goods, and how we can fund those. And he makes a through line to that and ecology, which I think is really interesting. And that's certainly not a new theme for Amagi, right? There's a lot of interest in our community in regenerative systems. And that's something that those within the project, like Mikhail and Dora, have worked to implement. But it's also something that we already have folks like Samuel Delesk at the Traditional Dream Factory, who we interviewed in season 1. He's that perfect example of the nomad to settler arc who's taken over this property in rural Portugal. And he has nomads coming and spending time in this land. He himself is a technologist. So he created a DAO, OASA DAO, for the purpose of like conserving some of the land that they have under management, and to not just conserve, but to be regenerative about that. When I interviewed Michelle Bowens, he talked about bioregional guilds. So I still want to interview people to sort of understand those steps a little bit more discreetly. But it does seem very clear that a lot of very smart folks are connecting AI, organization, abundance to ecology. And that's very interesting. Because again, this whole idea of like trophic layers and like reassigning certain organizational frameworks to the suitable layer. And when it comes to localizing, like, when you travel, do you travel? Like, it's an incredibly, I don't know, I think it's maybe said something about the type of traveler that you are. When you show up to a city and you see a McDonald's or you see the same high street shops that you do at home, like, what's the purpose of going to the other side of the world, right? The cosmopolitan side of that, like, we've really maxed that out. But the local side, when people travel, people always say they want authenticity, right? They want the local experience. What are the hidden gems? And growing up living in a very popular tourist areas, I've always sort of spotted the irony. And yeah, the more that we're globalized, the more that we're connected, the more that people travel, the more efficiencies that we've created, the more washed out this kind of localism has been, right? And again, to me, that's like the remote work layer. That's like, can people stick around? Can people use, whether they're working remotely or being part of the creator economy, the internet economy, can they utilize this to create local value rather than having to move to cities to experience opportunity and abundance? And that's very powerful in this moment in time, because I think there are a lot of things that we want to return to. The traditional ways have worked, and that's across a lot of vectors. I think there's a strong movement back to a surge in religiosity, because I think that's not a coincidence, you know. I think even before the whole threat of how AI is going to like reorganize the world, is a lot of people were experiencing burnout in work. There's this big question of like work-life balance, and like whether you could like find meaning in your work. That was already an open question, and I think that's just something that's becoming even more important to consider. If you can't count on your identity coming from your job, if you've moved around, like who do you belong to? Who are your people? And I think for a lot of people, the natural answer is actually just the old school one. Like, who is your family? Who are your people? Like, what's your tribe? And for some people, they're going to answer that in a very modern, choice-oriented way of just like, let me go search the internet and like go find my people there and we'll tribe up, right? But for a lot of people, it's the old way. It's like, why do you actually need to leave home? Maybe you can leave for experiences, but to not be forced to leave, I think is a very beautiful thing, to be able to invest. Because it is that traditionalism that we're sort of realizing is good for humanity. What am I talking about? So like this maximizing material abundance is like something like Temu, right? The online shopping site, and a lot of like modern prefab homes, a lot of fashion is basically just a bunch of cheap plastic. And some of it's fun, it's cultural. It moves sort of the economic lever, right? It's good for GDP, but is it actually good for people? Because we're realizing like plastic is such a horrible endocrine disruptor. We already knew that it was a pollutant, that it was not good for our environments. We're realizing like, as outward, so inside, like it's not good for our bodies either to be surrounded by these things. And that, natural fibers, traditional building techniques can actually be much healthier for us. So in the episode with Cynthia Tina, who runs Community Finders and also Eco Village tours, it was so fun for me to hear about her, again, her transmodern, her mixing old and new, the very slow process of her home construction in Vermont, but where she was taking the time to make sure that she used natural materials on her walls. And that's something that I wish I could do for our home here in Thailand more easily. And again, an example of just like, the default healthy choices should be the easy ones. And so I hope I'm starting to be able to like weave all of these threads together of what I mean by that. Because I think a lot of the problems that we're facing right now are problems of modernity. And we need to look at what we think is normal to figure out what's actually worth fixing, and what's worth this obvious solutions aren't necessarily inventions and innovations and progress, but it's a return to traditionalism. And I think a lot of us, I'm a millennial, and I think a lot of us in this generation or in the surrounding ones, we've kind of been raised to believe that traditionalism is bad. And maybe it's just me, who's gone much more conservative in certain ways, getting older, becoming a parent, sort of my own red pill moments. But I sort of realized like what a big psyop that was, because I'm sort of realizing, looking at things through a functionalist lens, right? Like the point of the thing is what it does, not what it says it does. And when I think about traditionalism, I think a lot of times we've been hung up on the side effects of the bad thing without fully understanding Chesterton's fence style, why it existed, right? And I think one of the hot button areas would be things like religion, where people saw abuse and power scandals, and religious wars and things like that. It's like, oh, we can't have that, therefore religion is bad. And we forget, because it turned out it was like load bearing. We assumed all these good things that came from religious organizations, like culture, like continuous cultural transmission of values, trust, morals, different layers of abstraction decisions that we outsourced to religion. Suddenly, without religion there, a couple generations later, we have to find ways to solve that problem itself, or even arguably like things like I would argue that things like the whole like woke moment is actually an expression of like particularly American religiosity, but just without Jesus in the middle to moderate it. So yeah, again, I think that's like a big part of my thesis is like a lot of the problems of modern life have come from maximizing the new and the innovative without truly understanding the value of the traditional. We're in a moment where there's like a lot more attention is paid to like the rejectors of traditionalism and then the fetishizers of traditionalism. And I think both of those people are making the category error, because like they're looking at the importance of the thing. Is it the thing itself, or is it the thing that it's meant to do? Are you rejecting or preserving the form of tradition or the function of tradition? And I think we're actually not always good at teasing that apart. And so that's been one of the fun things, I think, of going into these interviews and speaking broadly to so many different people. And as well as like my own unique place being like a local in a very traditional culture in like a cultural haven like Chiang Mai, but having a lot of access to global viewpoints. Again, like Michelle Bowens loves the city for a reason. I think it has something to do with his whole thesis of cosmolocalism. A little plug for my friend John, who was good enough to come on this last season and talk about his experiences with co-living, where I'm looking forward to him hosting this whole cosmolocal festival around Chiang Mai, where, yeah, we try to think about the unique opportunity that we have to better root those cultural nodes. And I think through what I've learned from our guests, I can look at these things as there's like the organizational layers that we're talking about, the technological opportunities, like there seems to me that there's been a lot of focus on the hardware side versus the software side. So like to take a step back a little bit, very inspired by folks like Sam doing a DAO for regenerative land. It's very interesting folks like who are looking at conservation and ecology and trying to tie that into technological systems. When it comes to intentional communities, they're practically synonymous with eco-villages. And stepping back a little bit, I'm kind of realizing like, oh, I think that's actually the easier portion to solve. A lot of folks want to go do the hardware portion, and it's important. But because it's tangible, because it's the land and the land demands what it demands, and we can actually lean on a lot of traditionalism and as well as innovation to think about better land management practices, we have a whole corpus of science that makes that a lot simpler to figure out. That's the hardware side of the new human organization picture that is kind of emerging. But the software side is actually the really complicated part because it's the culture side. It's because it, at the end of the day, like sun, soil, how much rain do you have? Like there's a limit to the technological fixes for that, but we have permaculture practices. We know how to do land management, but the people management part is so hard because no one wants to take away free choice. And that was the interesting part of the conversation with Michelle Bowens, is talking about how we might rebalance the commons. We are so used to thinking about the market and the state. And I think in the 20th century, again, we over-indexed for those because we were trying to create choice and opportunity. And we didn't realize that the commons were languishing. And what are the commons? It's voluntary human organization, I think in very natural, often emergent ways. But there needs to be enough space available. That's like not being managed by the market or the state, where people can self-organize. And I think that's something that's really missing. And that's the software side that I'm alluding to. And it's related to the hardware side, I think, because it kind of comes down to the touch points, like how do we interact with our environment? And that's how do we interact with people, and that's how do we interact with place. So those are things like architecture and city planning that I think we're starting to pay a lot more attention to. Someone else I'd love to have on the podcast is Alicia Peterson, whose Twitter I follow. And she's like, her whole thing is she's the courtyard urbanist. And the sort of form factor that she really advocates is courtyards, European style courtyards. Can America do those? Can we revise zoning codes so that America can take this form factor, something that exists in older cities like Brooklyn, where I lived for a time, where you have these tidy row houses, tight knit, where you don't have gaps between the buildings, and it creates, rather than having lots of parks that are central, actually each pocket of the neighborhood gets its own interior courtyard, a place where children can run around, lightly supervised, where neighbors can come together, where people can just naturally share spaces. That's one very interesting form factor. And of course, I interviewed John because, at least in the hospitality tourism context, I think co-living is another form factor for bringing people together, where they can organize, where they can congregate, where it's just a really fruitful ground for people to come together. And that's good for commoning, and I think that's arguably good for innovation too. Co-living where rather than optimizing for privacy, you're optimizing for human connection. I'd love to interview someone to talk about co-housing, because to me, that's also a really interesting form. An interview that I'd love to redo because I didn't get to, because our audio is not so good, but I spoke to a friend of mine, Andreas, who has been living in Bansko every summer with his family. And he loves this old European village because it's so walkable and the children play on the streets. And again, we don't have to reinvent new forms. Building European-style courtyards in America, while I think a worthy cause, but a difficult job, turns out that actually, we already figured it out because we evolved that way, is when we built limited by walkability, just by the very nature of our technology and our environment, we built places that were much more conducive to human gathering. It was much more natural for people to see each other in these small villages that we used to live in. And because of European architectural styles, some of those are much better preserved, and they're still around. Someone I also really want to interview is I would love to learn more about these European, €1 villa schemes, right? So many people say that they want to live in that environment with this old architecture and a walkable place. But a lot of these villages are no longer intergenerational, right? They have as much of an intergenerational problem in these rural Italian or Japanese villages as Garden City does, trying to sort of start up a new society. Is it multi-generational? In some cases, like these experiments have too many young people and not enough elderly people or not enough children. Some of these places, have a lot of old people and no one to continue on. I would love to learn more about those projects. And it's actually one of the Twitter accounts that I follow is for the Revillage group, the Traveling Families Revillage group, who are a group of families who've been traveling around the world together and are trying to build community in search of a village that they can take over. And for me, it's like, they're two different sides, Amagi versus this other approach. And what can we learn from each other? What was I going on about? Yeah, form factors. There's a couple historical form factors that we already know work really well for helping people to interact with their environment and with the people around them in a way that creates a lot of win-wins, but those are not equally distributed. In some places, it's because there's too much regulation in the wrong direction. In other places, it's because the market seems to be incentivized for something else entirely, like building little condos that atomize people. And in other places, it's just because it's just not a convention yet. So those are the stories I'm definitely interested to explore more because I think the solution lies in there. And maybe this is a good moment for me to pause and take a breath a little bit and like, where am I going with all of this? Like, thanks for following along with my wanderings. I think if I could sort of restate some of the big threads of this moment in time and what problems I think Amagi is trying to solve, we're looking at a huge disruption of AI. I don't think it's going to take away our jobs, but I think it's going to reorganize society. And that's a little bit scary. It's going to be a shakeup, but I think it does allow us to actually do admin and human coordination at much better scales. And that's going to be a tremendous opportunity. I think the 20th century has been defined by progress, and a very directional, opinionated progress, but we've actually learned a lot about human nature and the limits of maximizing some of those systems. And so now would be a good moment in time to have some humility and be willing to say that some of those directions were wrong or too far. And maybe the prudent thing would be to walk a couple steps back and figure out the optimum. I don't think that's going to be the same for every place, but it does matter to be a little bit more intentional about those rather than assuming that more technology, more modernity, more whatever is going to be the answer. I've been also trying to articulate a thread of, I think, cosmolocalism, of where we have where the power of the network state and those coordination layers and sort of building groups of by affinity and how that plays into physical communities, whether that's like nomads, families settling, startup cities. That's very interesting. But the part that's hard is keeping the localized side of that cosmolocal network, because we have done globalization, we have done like homogeneity very well, unfortunately, and it's actually time that we anchor and relocalize and think about valuing those things a little bit more than we perhaps have, at least like not on a superficial level. And then there's also this thread I'm trying to articulate about the hardware versus the software side of that. I think a lot of really good work is being done on the hardware side. And while we need to work on refining and improving that and just scaling those approaches and making them a lot more normal, I think that's the easier fix. I think it's the software side of culture and human coordination that's actually going to be much harder. And so with all those threads, those are all the background things I'm thinking about when it comes to what are we doing at Amagi and why? Because to me, Amagi is reinventing the village for the 21st century so we can future-proof society. As Michelle Bowen said, it's a seed form. And I think the project is or can be to articulate certain blueprints that will work in the cosmolocal context to figure out here are a couple form factors that provide a solution, but to perhaps be agnostic about the thing, because we don't want to get so caught up in the form that we lose the function. And so I can't believe I forgot to mention it before, but one of my favorite episodes that I've recorded recently has been with Andrew Rose, because as fun as it has been talking to community people, intentional community people, a lot of it's been in a very rural context. And I don't think that's for everyone. Whereas Andrew and the fractal scene have been built in New York, right? So I'm like, what are some of the lessons and some of the commonalities that we can notice from their experiment and apply it? So yeah, what are a couple different form factors for creating community, for doing things like childcare and education, entrepreneurship, land management, if you have it, creating rituals and trust and coordination? Like, what are the form factors? What are the social forms for doing that? And our first node, where we're intentionally rooted, is here in Thailand, right? So for about a year now, I think, Ofer and a crew have been in possession of a property down in Koh Phangan. And I was lucky enough to visit him a few weeks ago and actually watch him move in. So he is now like living there full time. And there's going to be a strong founder effect for that community. Koh Phangan is an island with an opinion about what it is. If you've ever been there, you'll know. But it's a very natural environment. It's very jungly. Oh my gosh, the insects there are going on all the time. It's like insects and birds. You really feel like you're in the jungle once you've driven up that hill. And the community on Koh Phangan is very spiritual. It's very international. And that's much more than Thai, to just be like honest. So one of their challenges is thinking about how to be integrated with the Thai community, because it's going to be harder for them to do that there than, say, in a place like Chiang Mai, where expats and locals are just proportioned differently. But so that's one of the active experiments, you know? And I think when Gear and I have spoken about what Amagi North might be, it might be a little different from Koh Phangan, because I think there people are going to be much more into yoga and sound baths and cacao ceremonies and ecstatic dance, right? And everyone there just gets that. And I think there's a certain amount of that hippie healing element in Chiang Mai too. But again, for the founder effect, if we're creating a community up here in Chiang Mai, for me, it's going to be much more oriented around families. And I think Gear has been a little torn because he's been spending time in Chiang Mai. He's spent lots of time in Koh Phangan, but he still goes back to Bangkok because that's where his kids are. So I think he himself, if I'm allowed to speak for him, is still drawn to perhaps these urban form factors. And we've had conversations about like, what could the Bangkok version of Amagi look like? Because at the end of the day, it's to like, what are the touch points? Are they physical touch points, technological touch points, like human rituals that we need to create to revitalize the commons? Because that's what the village is. The village is a small enough organization layer where you have people with real relationships, real trust. We're below Dunbar's number. So like socially, our brains are just better wired for interacting at this layer versus, an abstraction of a Discord server full of thousands of people or a nation state full of millions of people, it's easier for us to feel belonging there, and to manage those relationships without having a lot of rules and hierarchy and formality, where it just gives us some voluntary choice. That's like the big thing, right? Is people need to be able to volunteer to do these things so that they can be a part of it. And what are those things that we want people to do together? It's to raise children. It's to educate those children, and that's formally in terms of that reading, writing, arithmetic, as well as I think passing on sense of values. That's to take care of the environment, whether that's an urban environment or that's the land that's held in trust. I think maybe that is a dial that can be tweaked between different nodes, as we might call them. But people ought to take a sense of have a sense of collective responsibility that doesn't come with the full like commune version of like everyone has assigned chores, right? What's the right line to balance between private space versus public space? And what is the story of that community? What are our myths and rituals? Do people come together every Sunday to sauna? Or do they have meetups? One of the fun things about the episode with Elodie at Boundless Life was this whole concept of like dog fooding. She is like both a part of the company and a founder as well as a customer. She lives through that every day. And it's a very close relationship because those aren't just people that she's like living alongside. Those are people who like her kids' best friends, parents, and I don't think we're used to doing that. And that's something that, what is the Amagi version of that? How do we tweak those different dials so that we can do these things? And it's ventures and entrepreneurship as well, because again, to make good things the default, I think in the coming economy, people need to have a lot more agency. They're not going to be able to count on jobs so much. Maybe a certain amount of remote working jobs will still be there where people can choose to, be wherever they want, but be grounded in their present lifestyle. But probably a lot more people need to figure out how to be their own entrepreneurs. But rather than having to do that on your own from scratch, can Amagi be a venture builder to simplify some of that, especially if we have established nodes and established geographies? Then we're creating an interface with the nation state, right, where we can do a lot of that admin and overhead, just collectively. So as per my point about just this moment in time and the technologies and systems we have access to allow us to sort of organize more efficiently around certain trophic layers in a way that I think hopefully goes less against human nature and is more in harmony with it. And that comes back to the name of the project, Amagi Village, Amagi being the Sumerian word for return to mother, but also for freedom from what comes before. There used to be this like ancient practice that you can also see biblical allusions to of the Jubilee, of these certain moments in time where you free all the slaves, where you forgive all the debts, because you realize that whatever value is being stored there's so much more value to be unlocked by just setting the slate clean. And I think that's the interesting moment that we're really in. And all these different experiments that we're learning from the folks that we've interviewed is paints a really helpful picture. And I do think that the scary thing is AI is going to unlock a lot of value by just like nuking certain institutions, not physically. But I think it's hard to say what's going to be abolished, what's going to be made entirely redundant. But I don't think that's a bad thing, because we are, I think, hopefully realizing that what we need is a return of tribes. Tribalism has gotten a bad rep, but it's actually a very natural, normal human point of organization. A return for families, a return of the commons in order. this is like the ecological metaphor, right? Sometimes the big trees need to die so that enough sunlight, enough resources, enough organic matter can be made available for younger plants to restart. I think this is just a natural part of the cycle. And, there's that whole adage, like, may you live at an interesting time, and may you live in interesting times being kind of a curse. We live in very interesting times, but again, I'm a determined optimist. And if my request to Ofer and Gear has always been very consistent, I think, can we make Amagi a project for families? Because it's all well and good to think about the ecology side, the ventures side, but I think that's the thing that's really missing, is that we used to take care of the children together because we used to live in much smaller units that were more interrelated and more high trust. And we need the village again to practice that, because our children are the most precious thing. And do you trust your neighbor to help you raise your child? That's kind of scary, right? Cynthia Tina, I think one of the best things she spoke about was she wishes that when people looked at buying a home, they looked at who their neighbors were more. Isn't it so funny that our environment being one of the most impactful choices that we can make about our lives, when it comes to buying a home, we think along completely different things. So I've been a part of several experiments and had several failures along the way of trying to bring community together. And home buying is where the revealed preferences come. It's where rebellion and values go to die. I've seen so many times that, we're used to think about our home as a place for financial security, for comfort, and in a world where we have so many options, it's actually really rare for people to choose community, because it's a big ask. It's a big ask to help someone. It's also a big ask to burden them with the task of helping you. And our children are actually the very natural organization point, because raising children on your own is really hard. And some of us are lucky enough to be able to hire help, but I think that's not the ideal. I think we all naturally gravitate to wanting those to be, relationships with friends. And I know the closer that my friends have lived to me, the more I can automate my social life, the happier I've been, whether I was living in the college dorm or when I was living in London, I lived in this warehouse community, and there were always people around, and I got to be, as I call, a lazy extrovert, because this is the coordination problem. I don't want to have to plan a party all the time. I don't want to have to text 30 different friends. I just want to know where my people are going to be, and we can just keep showing up for each other. And for me, so many things are not a coincidence. I felt weird at one point in time, but then I realized it turns out to just be basic and millennial AF to just want to buy property or land and just live there with all of your friends. Because we've experienced a loneliness epidemic. Society is extremely atomized. We have so much choice, and for whatever reason, we are not making the choices that bring people together. And I think that's a form factor. I think that's architecture, and that's city planning. And that's the level that I think Amagi can come in, because the real estate market and developers work according to a certain plan, but we need someone to establish a new pattern so that not everyone has to reinvent the wheel, from the acquiring the land to how it's going to be financed to how you organize and coordinate between neighbors. What are the different dials of privacy versus shared space, of the amenities provided, to try to create a template that people can borrow and build off of. So honestly, Amagi, what is it? At this moment, it's still pretty up in the air. I think this is a good time for folks who have an opinion to step in and really invest, because Ofer's down in KP and the invitation is there. If you want to contribute, now's the time to come invest, come be a part of it, put your stamp on it. I think for Gear and I in the north, or hey, maybe somebody's in Bangkok, and that's actually where Gear will end up if he can have a nice environment and just spend more time with his girls there. Who wants to build the village? I thought it might be hard to do a solo episode, and it's definitely felt a little bit challenging. Gosh, I hope you're still listening. If you are, thank you. Because I've wandered around a bit, but it's actually been really fun and really easy to get a lot of this out. And I hope it makes sense, I don't know if anyone's like so woo-woo like me, but I'm into human design, and apparently I'm a projector, and my gift to the world that I'm supposed to do is to actually just reflect the things that I notice. And so that's my job that I'm trying to do here. And honestly, like, you're over, thank you for trusting me with this. It really has been a joy. Like, I'm a perpetual student, and it has been so fun to have these people on. To all of the guests on the podcast, like, thank you for your time. Thank you for your expertise. Like, thank you for having genuinely like really fun and enlightening conversations and opening me up to your world. It's been a privilege to sort of put that in front of our audience and share. And so, yeah, conversations, I'm like very eager to continue as we go on. But, if I'm making one CTA here, it's like, hey, I think we're really at a moment in time with Amagi where we need some strong commitment from folks to figure out where we're going next. Because again, I think where we are now is we're in Thailand, but we have a global network. And I think this thing that we can be doing is establishing a blueprint. There's a white paper, there's an economic model, there's there's been a lot of AI renderings and possibilities, but we need to figure out what we're actually building. And what we're actually building matters, because our relationship to the land, to the community around us, and to our physical environment and the neighbors who are in proximity, I think that's really the point. Because by building that, we can then layer the social aspect on top of that. And I think that's how we figure out the solution to, how we future-proof ourselves as a collective, by starting a seed form and having lots of cosmolocal nodes and experiments that I think serve the unified whole. It's weird times that we live in, but it's very fun and exciting. So I think I will leave it at that, my audience. Thank you guys so much. It's been a pleasure to be your host. Thank you. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Lily Szabo, and this has been the Amagi Village podcast. Amagi is the ancient Sumerian word for return to mother. It's also the earliest denotation of emancipation and freedom. Not freedom through escape, but through return, through restoration, integration, through rebirth. The world is quickly changing, and the myth of modernity is coming undone. Progress is not linear, and to thrive in the coming age, we can't keep living in the matrix and just hoping for the best. It's time to embark on bold experiments. We don't claim to know what the answer is, but we know it won't come from ideology. This isn't a cult, it's not a brand. Amagi is an invitation for those who don't just play with new ideas, but are ready to live them, to walk the talk, to build the future. The Amagi Village podcast documents our journey of discovery. We're learning in public from technologists and tribal elders, from philosophers and farmers. Let's reimagine the future together. Please visit amagi.life to learn more. That's amagi.life.